I'll just say quickly what Michael and I were speaking about now is Chazara, the value of reviewing what you've learned. And maybe I'll actually take time out to speak about that more some other time. But if you want to retain what you've learned, and also, as I said to Michael, the Gra said to his student, Rav Chaim Volozhin, that you don't really get something until you've learned it 101 times, based on a Ma'amar Chazal. And I can speak for myself to say that, I've done Chazorah on a number of things. And sometimes I usually try to listen to the recordings of the shir before I do the next shir. In other words, I try to go over what I said before I give the next shir. And occasionally I'll listen to old recordings, old meaning maybe just from 2 or 3 months ago. And I'm amazed at how much I've forgotten or things that I realize now I should have said, or things that other ways I should have put it. So, and that's on a very small scale. So Chazorah is very important. In terms of the shir today, I as I was listening to the shir last week, I said that maybe we'll start to look into a little bit of, at least as a sidebar, about shiurim generally, right? So we had this Rav Ashi's question last week was when the etzim kisorah, is that with the klipa, is it without the klipa, is it a moist one or is it a dry one, and so forth. So I wanted to take a little time, and we may do more of this actually next week, but just now as a kind of introductory thing, I wanted to look at some of the Mishnayot that talk about these questions. So, Michael, I know you do Mishnah. Did you ever do Kelim? Did you learn Kelim? You're muted.
Yeah, yeah. I have learned it, but the last time I learned it, it's a while ago. We're we're on Nashim now, so it's been a while.
Okay, very good. Okay, Kelim is also it's difficult. Oh, Taharot in general is very difficult. The Rambam wrote a special introduction to his Perush on Taharot, and he says it's an extensive introduction where he lays out the basics of all of Taharot and Tuman, Tahara, and so forth. And he says, interestingly enough, apropos of Chazara, he says that you need to learn this introduction the way you know Kriyat Shema. And the reason being because Taharot, there's an internal logic to Taharot, but it's not something that makes sense. A lot of the basic ideas don't make sense, like why are some things mitameh in a certain way and other things aren't, and how they're mitameh. Are they mitameh b'masa or b'mishkav or b'midras and so forth? They're very complicated, and they're not necessarily things that you would have thought of, except that the Torah lays out these rules. And so that's what I mean. There's once you can have the basics, then there's an internal logic, but externally, arguably most of it doesn't make sense to put it that way. Anyway. What we're going to look at today, though, are a few Mishnayot in Masechet Kelim, Perek Yud Zayin, to give us an idea of how Chazal looked at Shiurim. So the first Mishnah I want to look at, I'm going to decide as I go through which ones we want to do, but maybe most of them. It starts off like this: Kol klei ba'alei batim shiuran berimonim. All the vessels of Baalei Batim. So what does that mean? In other words, Kelim that non-professionals use. Balabayit in this sense is a non-professional. It's like what you use at home. So their shiur is measured in pomegranates. And what shiur are we talking about? I don't know, Michael, maybe you know?
I'm not, no, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Okay, so there's a concept that a kli that's broken at some point when it's no longer useful, it will become tahor, right?
Whether it retains its the tumor or not. Yes.
Right. And it meaning yes. In other words, it could be that it was tameh, and now just by virtue of the fact that it's no longer usable becomes tahor, or it means it's not going to be mekabel tuma. So a kli of a balabayit, that's so we're talking about vessels that hold things, right? So if it has a hole that's big enough for a pomegranate to go through, then it's tahor. Then it becomes tahor. Because so that's a big hole. But the point is, you could until it gets that big, so you could still use it for large things like pomegranates. It has to use its usefulness. So at the point that it can no longer hold rimonim, then it's tahor. Rabbi Eliezer mer b'mashehem. He says b'mashehem, as Bartanura explains, kol hakelim shiran kishe'en ruyin lishtamesh ben me'en tashmish hayu mishtamshin ben tchila. All kelim, their shiur is when they're no longer fit for using for the purpose that they were used to begin with. Kagon kelim amyuchadim l'tainim shiuran b'motziteina. Meaning, so if you had a kli that you had made specifically to hold figs, then once it has a hole in it big enough that figs will fall through it, then it's tahor. V'amiyuchadim l'zeitim shiran b'motzi zayit ben halacha k'Rebbi Eliezer. So b'mas shehin, meaning that we measure the shear based on their original purpose, but we don't hold like Rabbi Eliezer. I'm going to skip down. These are all
strange. The original purpose or the purpose it had when you used it, because a kli, well, I don't know, an amphor, you could put many different things into this kli. So somebody would put it into it zeitim, and another one rimonim, and I don't know. But it wasn't just fabricated for that purpose or another purpose.
So this is the sheet. So the Tanakama holds basically like you're saying, that in other words, a kli, any kli, once it's nifchat, right? Once it has a hole that's big enough for pomegranates to go through, then you consider it tahor, because like you're saying, because
it's a kind of universal measure.
Yeah.
Although a pomegranate can be bigger and small also.
No, so that's the thing. That's what we want to get to. Exactly. So the mission is going to talk about what pomegranate do you mean? But the basic idea is like you're saying, that according to the Tanakama, we base the shiur of when it becomes tahor based on ribon, because we see the kelim as general purpose, even if you originally thought to use them for a specific purpose. So, I think we do this ourselves. Maybe you have, maybe I'm just thinking off the top of my head. Let's say I think this happened to me once. I had like a large salad bowl, and then it cracked, but it would still hold things, but I wouldn't use it to serve food anymore. But I might use it, let's say, just to put fruit out, whole fruit, not for salad, it's things like that. In other words, we tend to repurpose kelim as long as they still have a purpose, as long as they're still usable. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying that actually, we're going to go after what the original purpose was, and Tanna Kama says no, it's whatever you use it for. So now we're going to skip down to Mishnah Daled. Harimonim she'amru. So what rimonim were they talking about when they said b'motzi rimon? Shlosha achuzin ze b'zeh. They were talking about the case where you had 3 rimonim. Just a second. That were literally holding on to one another. This isn't yet about the particular type of rimon. This is a slightly different issue. Bartanur explains, Hadi nan bereish pirkim kol kei balei batim shiurim berimonim yishiyu shlosha rimonim achuzim ze b'zeh v'yetzeh ha'echad derech hanekev. What does he mean? That when we measured to figure out if the hole was big enough for a pomegranate to go through, the way you measure that is not by taking a rimon and putting it over the hole and seeing if it falls through. What you do is you put 3 rimonim in the kli, and then you see if one of them will fall through, right? Because meaning the hole has to be big enough that maybe when you're moving the kli, which it talks about, that's when it will fall through. In other words, it's bigger which means it has to be bigger than just the exact diameter of the pomegranate. Right, because you could have a pretty big hole at the bottom, and you put 3 rimonim together, none of them will fall out. But they could fall out if you start to move the kli. But it still would have to be bigger than just big enough for the rimon to fall through. And see, in this vein, Rabban Shimon ben Gami Omer benafa uvekvara kedei shito v'yihalech. When we're talking about right, so these are different types of sieves that also, once they get a hole that's big enough for a rimon, then they're tahor. It's kedei shito v'yihalech. That is, the hole has to be big enough that when you have 3 rimonim in it and you pick it up and you go, that one of them will fall through. Anyway, this is not exactly our thing. And then it talks about shara kelim she'enan yicholim lekabel rimonim. What if you have a kli that's not to begin with big enough to hold a rimon, right? So you have smaller kelim. In fact, there are tiny kelim that they used to use for holding
a bottle. You can't put the rimon in the bottle.
You can't put it in a bottle, and also they would have the Mishnah talks about also these tiny things that they might hold for perfume or for special oils or things like that. So they had many sizes. I don't know if you've ever seen. And I haven't been there literally in decades, but I remember at the Tel Aviv Museum, they had a very good display of ancient pottery. They had a lot of pottery from Bayit Sheni, and there's a whole array of sizes, which at the time when I was actually learning the Mishnayot of Kelim, it really helped me to visualize a lot of the particular Kelim they were talking about. So, Kol Kelim shenan yechulim mekaber rimonim kegon harova, b'chatzi harova, haknonim aktanim, right? So these were different measures, right? Rova hakav and half of a rova, and these little things. Shiurin beruban, the shear of how much they have to be missing is when once most of the kli is gone, then it's tahor. Divrei Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon Omer b'zeitim. He says smaller kelim you measure by if an olive can go through it or not. Nifritzu shiran b'zeitim, meaning if they are broken through, then you measure by zaitim, for zayit can go through. Nigmamu, if they're lessened by the side, let's say the sides start to come off, as opposed to the bottom or the side, then shiran bin mashahem, then the shear is whatever it is they are. In other words, as long as they can still retain something, right? And there's because you still have the bottom, as long as you can still retain something, they're going to still be tameh. Okay. Now, more to the point of what we're interested in.
Shel,
Yeah.
is there some basis to those rules? Do they come from some pasuk in the Torah? I don't know, from somewhere. They are just opinions, or one person thinks like this and the other like that, or they have some reason, or I don't know.
So some of them are based on Dioraita, some are like tradition, and some of them are Drabanan. So we may touch on some of that as we go through.
So they're just invented, or
no,
people
that's
just
not, they're not just invented. It's first of all, you're asking a very good question. I want you to hold on to the question. Let's hold on to the question. Here we are in Mishnah Hey. Harimon sha'amru lo katan v'lo gadol ela beinoni. Okay. So the Rimon of which they spoke, right? So now we've been talking about Rimon because I need to know the size of the Rimon in order to determine if my kli is tahor or tameh. So which Rimon are they talking about? So they say not large, not big, and not small and not big, but rather medium. Now, again, you'll have
they
questions.
use statistics. They say,
Well,
we take the median.
I want to no, you're laughing, but that's you'll see in the next Mishnah, that's exactly what it's going to be. We'll see in a minute. Who's Kuru Rimone Badan? Why did they mention Rimone Badan? Badan is a place that the Rimonim from Badan were the size that we would use for this measure. Shiyum Mikadshin Kol Shehen. I'll explain this briefly. That is it's Kevan she'ein misharin bahen el berimon benoni. So why were Rimone B'da'an mentioned? Just a second. Shiyu mikadshin kol shehen divrei Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri mesher bahen etzakelim. So, what does it mean mikadshin bahen? That, like the Bartanur says, Shimechad me rimone vada'an shel orla o shel kilai hakerem nitarev in elef rimonim shel heter. Nitkatshu kulan v'neasru, Mashen came berimonim shel shar mekomot. So there's this idea, if you have fruit that's orla, we'll just talk about orla, right? So if you have fruit that's orla, what if it falls into a barrel or a big container of the same kind of fruit, and now I no longer know which are fruit of heter and which is orla. So in the case of Rimonei Badan, according to Rebbe Meir, all of them, all of the kupa, whatever the container was that has the rimonim, now they're all asur. They're all nitkadshu. In other words, this has to do in Orla about the and we see this in other things also in Zraim, that the amount at which an isur is batel depends on it. It's going, when we talk about Orla, it's going to, let's say, depend on what we're talking about. So he's saying here, in other words, we're used to this idea, like we're familiar with the idea of batel b'shishim. So batel b'shishim is an gzeira d'Rabbanan about basar b'chalav. That the idea is that midioraita chad betrei batil. One that's mixed with two is batel. As long the meaning, as long as you have a simple majority that's heter, then if an isur falls into it, it's still mutar. But midirabanan, Chachamim were gozer on different isurim to not be batel except at higher ratios.
Is this a gader?
Yeah. So in the case, so here he's saying, so why did they mention Rimonei Badan? In other words, there was a tradition. What we see from here, Lama, who's Karul Rimonei Badan, there was some tradition that came down that used Rimonei Badan particularly as a shear. So why? So the Mishnah says, why did they mention Rimonei Badan? So Rabbi Meir says, Shumikadshin Kol Shehed, that there was something special about Rimonei Badan, that they weren't batel in ever, right? Once they fell in, they're not into other Rimonim, they're not batel. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri omer l'shaer bahen et kelim. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said no, that Rimonei Badan were used as the standard for the size of a pomegranate that we would determine whether or not a kli is tohu or tameh, as we've been discussing. And Rabbi Akiva says, l'chachu huzkuru. They were mentioned for both points. The she'er bahen kelim v'yu mekadshin kol shehem. Amar Rabbi Yossi lo huzkuru rimonei badan v'chatzirei geva ela shiyu mitasrin v'dai b'chol makom. So Rabbi Yossi has a different reason, that the only reason that Rimonei Badan and Chatzirei Geva, Chatzirei is a kind of, the Chatzir here is a kind of a leek. They were mentioned in their contexts. The Barton says Shnei Mekomot Shel Kutin Heim. Badan and Geva were both places. They were geographic locations that where the Kutim lived. V'nikarim hayu rimonim v'chatzir shel mekomot ha'elu merimon v'chatzir shel shar mekomot. They were recognizably different than other rimonim and other chatzirim. V'chuta'ei v'adai lo ma'asrei maidim nizabnei la'achrine. It was known that a kuti would not take maser on what he sold to others. They were not worried about, in other words, Kutim kept the Torah, but they didn't hold by rabbinic tradition. So by rabbinic tradition, we say lifnei iver lo titein michshol doesn't only mean literally that you don't put a stumbling block before a blind person. We conceptualize it to mean that you don't let somebody, help somebody or not stop somebody blindly committing an avera, right? Look, you don't put something in front of somebody where they think that what they're doing is okay, and you know that it's not okay. That's part of the idea of lo titein michshol. So they're not makbid on lo titein michshol, presumably because it's not a literal understanding of the Torah. Afal gavdel v'nefshayim ma'asri, even though they themselves did take maaser, but we would assume that when they were selling to other people, they wouldn't take maaser. Hilkach mitasrim v'adai b'chol makom. Therefore, whatever you would buy from the kuti, you would have to take maaser from, as if you assume, not as if you assume for certain that they didn't take maaser. Masha'en ken, if you took from a Jew, you might be besafek about whether they took, right? So that's how we get demai. That there was an idea that actually a minority of Amei Haaretz didn't take maaser, and so because we're not sure, even though most of them did, but there was a significant minority that didn't. So there was a gzeira on demai. But we consider fruits and vegetables that we get from Amei Haaretz as if they didn't have maaser taken. But when you buy from a kuti, you have to assume that nothing was taken, midioraita. So what Rabbi Yossi is saying is the traditions regarding Rimonei Vadan and Chatzirei Geva are only about this, that if you see them, like if you see them in the shuk for sale, you will know that they came from Kutim because they were recognizably different than other Rimonim and other Chatzirim, and you had to take Trumas and Meisters from them, or at least Maaseh. Okay, now Kabetza Shamru,
the Mishnah doesn't. There is no kuti in the Mishnah. Where does it come?
Oh, kutim are mentioned many times in the Mishnah.
No, here I don't see it in the text.
Oh no, it's not here. But that's filled out by the. In other words, that's the Perush that's filled out by the Bartanura. That Bada'an and Geva were mekamot of kutim. Yadua. And so
there were kutim in Eretz Israel. I thought they were only in Babel. I never heard.
Oh no, the Hefa kutim were only in Eretz Israel. The kutim essentially we will identify them with the Shomronim.
Okay.
The kutim were those people who were living in Eretz Israel at the time of Shivat Zion.
Okay, on which Ezra didn't want to integrate. Well, that was a big mistake, a big mistake. Okay.
No, so that's a whole separate issue. They were also still worshiping idols as a low Muvan Mela. That's that. So maybe we'll do a separate share about Kutim sometime, which would probably be worth doing. In any event, so that's what the Kutim aren't mentioned explicitly because it's understood from the Mishnah that we're talking about places of Kutim. Anyway, to get closer to our issue, Kabetza Shamru, Lo Gedola V'Lo Ktana Ela Beinonit. So now, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mevi Gedola Shebigdolot. You bring the biggest one that you can. In other words, the biggest one, we're talking about, everybody's going to agree that we're talking about chicken eggs, not other kinds of eggs. But you bring the biggest egg that you can, Uktana shebiktanot, and the smallest one that you can find. V'noten letoch hamayim, v'choleket hamayim. Right, so you put them in a kli of water, and you'll measure by displacement. So let's say you have a kli that's going to be, 1 liter. You fill up water to a liter, and you put another kli underneath it to catch the water that's going to come out. You fill it up to the top. You put the eggs in, the big one and the little one. The water comes out. You take the water that comes out, and you divide that in half. So it's statistics. You're going to take the, what would that be? That's the mean, right? That's it's going to be halfway between the biggest one and the smallest one. That will determine the volume of a kibetza. Amar Rabbi Yossi, now Rabbi Yossi challenges Rabbi Yehuda's shita. He says, "V'chi mi modieni ezo hi gdola ve'ezo hi ktana." Who's going to tell me which is big and which is small? Ela hakol lefi da'ato shoroeh. Rather, it's going to go after the opinion of the person who's observing. So this is right. So this is a very important point. Let's look at the Bartanura for a minute. Kabetza shamru gabetzu matocholin shein metamim befachot mikabetza. The Beitza that we're talking about, he says this is regarding tumat ochlim shein metamim befachot mikabetza. That the idea is that ochel is not mitamei midioraita. This is all together in his gzeira d'Rabbanan. That if food becomes tamei, then midirabanan, in certain circumstances, it will be mitamei other ochli. But the minimum size for the ochel to be in order to transfer tuma has to be at least a kibetza, and then it could be mitamei even a tiny amount of food, but it itself has to be at least a kibetza. So, right, he says, "Noten letoch hamayim, memalei kos mayim, v'noten letocho gedola shebigdolot uktana shebiktanot, v'cholek hamayim yotzin l'shnei chalakim, v'chelek ha'echad hu shiur beitza." So, as we explained, and Rabbi Yossi says, "V'chi modienu klomar kishlokech gedola shebigdolot, shemi yesh yoter gedola hemena." Who's to say that the biggest one you could find is the biggest one possible? Maybe there's another one that's bigger. Ela kol lefi da'ato shoroeh, lefi omed da'ato shehi benonit l'mareh einav. It goes after whatever the person who's observing thinks is an average-sized egg. V'halacha k'Rabbi Yossi. Halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. Now, we'll come back to this, but let's just do a little bit more in the Mishnah, and then I'll skip to something in the Shulchan Aruch. We'll see what it says. Kagrogeret she'amru, right? So we know about the grogeret, but also it's a shiur in Shabbos, which I'll show you in a second. Kagrogeret shamru lo gdola v'lo ktana ela beinonit. Rabbi Yehuda omer gdola shebe'eretz Yisrael hi ha-beinonit shebemedinot. The largest grogeret that you get in Eretz Yisrael is an average size grogeret in other countries. One second. Just to show you grogeret in another context. Here
The
we
fact
have,
that they didn't have standardized measures is a real nuisance. How do you say in English?
yeah, a nuisance.
Mhm.
So this is what we're talking about. The idea is, in other words, you see what's happening is Chazal are trying to get a semblance of a standardized of a standardized measure. They want standardized measurements, but like when we see Rabbi Yossi, then we could ask ourselves. So when he says "Kol lefi haroeh," so maybe what he's saying is that actually there isn't a true standardized measure at all. That it's a measure that's, in a sense, going to be contextual or relative to the people that are involved. Now we have one example of that, which we still use today, that we already learned, that even though the shiur of eating on Yom Kippur is kigogeret, but what's the shiur of drinking on Yom Kippur?
The cheek, no, have a mouthful.
Right, it's one cheekful. And there we say, poskim hold that is a relative measure. That depends on each person, it's their cheekful.
If you are touch more, so you can put a lot of water with your cheek.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there I think that yeah, anyway, we can talk about it, like why conceptually it's different. But the point is, it's a relative measure. So when Rabbi Yossi says "Hakol lefi haroeh," basically, so he's not saying they're relative measures, but you can think of it this way. I think there's more to be said about this, but you can think of it, I think, this way, that you see, we're going to encounter these issues on a personal level, right? We encounter them as people. And so what's important is your perception in any given situation. That is what's kovea. In other words, it could be that according to Rabbi Yossi, it's not just that he's saying you can't have a standard because we'll never know what the biggest baits are and the smallest baits are. So that's a challenge to Rabbi Yehuda, and he's saying to him, your standard is no standard because I'll never know if it's truly a standard or not. And I think the idea is that Rabbi Yossi pushes that whole idea away, and he says it's not necessary to have a uniform standard, because really what's important is the individual perspective of the person who's encountering this problem. That's the way we're going to look at it. Kgrogeret also appears here in Mishnah Shabbat. Amotzi tevin kimlo pi para, etza kimlo pi gamal, amir kimlo pi taleh, asavim kimlo pi gdi, le shum v'ale betzalim lachim kgrogeret yuveshim. I'm sorry, kgrogeret. Kgrogeret. That, and then Yeveshim, if they're dry, it's Kamlo Pigadi. In other words, on Shabbat, there's the shiur for carrying food depends on the food that you're carrying, because there's an idea that you need to still carry something that has a use, it has a purpose. And so for these things, like alei betzalim and alei shum that are still moist, that haven't been dried out, you're going to use that for animal feed. So a kgrogeret is enough to use. It's like a minimum amount that you would use for animal feed, but less than that you wouldn't. Okay, and yeveshim kemo pigdi. But if they're dry, then you measure it by the size of the mouth of a kid. Okay, so we're not going to go through all of this, but this is another place where we see kgrogeret as a shiur. And okay. Kazayit shamru, lo gadol v'lo katan, ela benoni, ze egori. So the kazayit that they said, and here the bartender says, Kigon kazayit min hamet, umina nevela shemitameh. These are also shiurim and tuma. And he also says, V'rov shiurim shebetorah b'kazayit. Actually, most shiurim in the Torah are the kazayit. Meaning, as we see, certain things, certainly about things of eating, right? We're going to base ourselves on a kazayit. Ze egori. And what does it mean, egori? That it's negar b'tocho, that the oil is still inside of it. Shishmano agur b'tocho. We're talking about not a dried olive, but rather an oily olive, an olive that still hasn't had its oil pressed out of it. That's the kazayit shamru, right? And then it says kisa'ora shamru lo gedola v'lo ktana el benonit zumi barit, and that's talking about a desert sa'ora, and then ka'adasha and so forth. In other words, you see, they're using these. They're going to be using for all of these shiurim. We're using a middle size, a benonit. Then it talks about length measures, ha'amash amru, and it talks about this. All right, so there are there's a lot to be said here. I'm going to switch though to the Shulchan Aruch and the Aruch HaShulchan to try to round out some of the concepts that we've gotten. So here, this is in Hilchot Pesach. So of course we need to know kazayit on Pesach for example, for all the shiurim that we're going through. You have to eat a kazayit of matzah. If you had a korban Pesach, you would have to eat a kazayit of korban Pesach. You have to eat a kazayit of maror. So, Shulchan Aruch says, again, here I'm skipping a long discussion, but we'll get a lot of the discussion from the Aruch HaShulchan. Shiur kazayit yeshomrim dahavi kechatzi beitza. Some people say kazayit is the half the size of an egg. Haga, Ramah says, v'yochena biyachad v'lo ma'at ma'at. You have to eat it all together and not little by little. Uvirakot, when you're talking about vegetables, like for maror, tzarich lim'och chalal ha'avir shebein hayarak. If it's, you have to, in other words, basically you don't measure it as a two-dimensional measure. There might be air that's in the yerek itself. Ushair shiur kazayit birakot atzpan v'lo ba'avir shebenehi. In other words, you have to figure out the volume of the actual amount of vegetable that you're eating. Let's look here at the Aruch HaShulchan. Excuse me. Shiur kazayit tenan beperek shiva asar de kelim. We learn in the 17th chapter of Kelim. They know lo gadol v'lo katan ela benoni ayen sham. So that's the mission that we just looked at. That the kazayit we're talking about is not big, it's not small, it's average. Yadua machloket ben Rashi v'Tosfot la'Rambam. There's a machloket between Rashi and Tosfos on the one hand, the Rambam on the other hand. The Rashi v'Tosfos sovrim the kazayit hu kechatzi beitza. They hold, as a matter of fact, that a kazayit for these halachic purposes is half the size of a beitzah, and the Rama holds it's a third of a beitzah. Lachein b'matzah deoraita. So now, when you have to figure out how much matzah you eat on Leil HaSeder, which is a mitzvah deoraita, afilu bizman hazeh, pshita sheyesh leilech lechumra v'lechol kechatzi beitzah. So there, obviously, because it's a mitzvah d'oraita, we'll go after the machmir, and here the chumrah is going to be to eat the larger shear. So you have to eat a half of a beitzah of matzah on Leil HaSeder. Maror shehu d'Rabbanan yachol leilech lekula. Since you're only eating maror midrabanan, you could be somech on the Rambam that you just need to eat a third of a beitzah because it's only a d'Rabbanan. U'inyan bracha achrona u'birkat hamazon safek brachot lahakel v'lo yivarech ad sheyochal kechatzi beitzah. So if you have to figure out, should I bench after I ate, let's say bread? So since it's a suffix to Rabbanan, or suffix bracha is a hakel. So he's saying then you wouldn't bench unless you were certain that you ate at least a half of a beitzah. Person should always try to remove himself from any doubt. And even if it's a shir d'Rabbanan like maror on the Haseder, it's fit and proper to go after Nisha mitzvah chaviva, or to lehader, to make it beautiful. So there's this idea of hidur mitzvah by being machmir on how much you eat, ukayem l'chol hadayot, and thereby you'll fulfill the mitzvah according to all the opinions. Kvar be'erna le'el siman tafek ayin bet sif yud bet sheyesh megdolim shotzim lichpol et ha'shiurim. We already explained earlier that there are gedolim that want to double the shiurim. The she'en da'atenu noteken. And we don't hold like that. Be'erna ze gam b'siman kuf samachet v'yirodeh siman shin chaf daled b'amachmir yachmir la'atzmo v'lo laharot la'acherim. If you want to be machmir by these gedolim, then you can be machmir for yourself, but you shouldn't paskin for others that they have to be machmir. So this has come up a few times, and we still haven't done it, but I think I mentioned to you, the controversy came about in the late 18th century, and a number of gedolim at the time thought that shiurim should be double, and it's based on comparing, it's based on observation. It wasn't that they just said, oh, let's be machmir. It was based on observation about things that don't seem to add up based on the way Chazal talk about them and based on their personal observation. And so they came to the conclusion that maybe shiurim now have to be bigger. That's a separate shiur. If you want, we can go into it, but I don't think I'll do it. I'm not going to do it today. But among the people who talked about it were the Baal Tosos Yom Tov and the Noda Yehuda Landa. The Gra talks about it, and then even though many Gedolim held that the shiurim should be much bigger, it wasn't widely accepted. And you see that here, this is a little, roughly 100 years later, the Aruch HaShulchan says that he Bichal doesn't really hold like these Gedolim. And he also says, don't be machmir for other people. And then you skip to the 20th century, and we have the Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish did hold that shiurim should be larger. Again, it's not that he just thought of this as a chumrah. It's based on how he understood these things. And despite what the Aruch HaShulchan said, half a generation earlier, we know that it swept much of the Orthodox world to have bigger shiurim. And that's a whole discussion unto itself. And I think I've mentioned this before. If you want, if you've ever, maybe if you haven't, recommend reading a long essay that Chaim Soloveitchik wrote about, I guess, 25 years ago or so, where he talks about what happened in the Orthodox world, that it went from what he calls the mimetic tradition. The mimetic tradition is the tradition you have by miming, by repeating the way you learned as you were being brought up. And he contrasts that with a textual approach, that sometime after in the late 20th century, there was this shift that before then people tended to do halacha not like theoretical things they might have learned in yeshiva, like that shiurim are twice as big, but everybody had a seder every year, and this is how much we ate. That was the mimetic tradition. And he said, but something shifted after the Holocaust, and people started to lean on the way things were brought down in Sfarim, rather than the way they learned at home. And that's a very interesting sociological phenomenon. And if you want, I'll send you a link. You can download that essay for free. But I digress. I think
so the machloket is not on what is a half, what is a betza, what is a median betza, mean betza. The machloket is how.
The machloket, you mean the machloket between whether we have large...
how to... איך לתרגם את הגודל של המשנה לגודל סטנדרטי של היום.
Yeah, more or less. It's going to be based... Okay, B'li Neder, next time, I won't go through the whole thing, but next time I'll try to prepare just a really basic introduction to this machloket. I'll have to write that down. Because it's worth understanding, because it's something that persists to this day when we have the question of shiurim. I'd like to explain it better than what I'm explaining it now, so I need a little bit more time to prepare.
Has this also got to do, for instance, with the time you have to wait ben basari lechalavi? When you are in Eastern Europe, it's 6 hours. In Germany, it's 4 hours, and in Holland, it's 1 hour or something like this. Yes,
that's actually those are right. So those are different minhagim that came up over many generations. That really midioraita, you don't have to wait between. Really, all you need to do is to clean your mouth out. You just need to make sure that, let's say, if you're eating meat, you have to make sure that you have no meat in your mouth before you start eating cheese. And even then, maybe that's also a chumrah, because midioraita, and it's a midirabanan, because midioraita, you're not over on eating basar b'chalav unless they were cooked together. Right? Lo tivashel, that's what we get from lo tivashel. They still have to be cooked together. But since that's anyway, there's a famous joke about that, where the Torah says lo tivashel gedi b'chalev yimo 3 times. So the joke is, Kadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, lo tivashel gedi b'chalev yimo. So he says, oh, so I can't eat milk with meat. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, Lo tivashel gedi b'chalev imo. Says, oh, I have to wait 6 hours if I had meat before I have cheese. Kadosh Baruch Hu says a 3rd time, Lo tivashel gedi b'chalev imo. He says, oh, so I need to have like separate tablecloths for fleshik and milching. So God says, oh, have it your way. That's the joke. Anyway, צריך להיזהר כשמשאר כזית מרור בירקות, שיצא בהם ידי חובת מרור. So now, if you're going, now that we talk about shiurim, so, you know, you have to eat enough maror to be yotze. Shima echalalo sheben ha'alim. So the maror he's talking about here, of course, is chasa, right? So you have to make sure that they're not all puffed up. You have to make sure that, like, when you press it down all together, it equals a kazayit. Yureshe shebeha'alim atzman yeh kazayit, that the alim themselves have to have the shir b'kazayit, v'lo behavir shebenehem, not including the air that's between the alim, between the leaves. V'chein im b'matzah yesh chalal, ein hachalal mitztaref lekazayit, which is really a reference to the way Ashkenazim make matzah, because there are little air holes. Right, but if it's a soft matzah, it's made like a sponge, then you don't have to mush it in to see how, you know, you can eat it according to the kazayit as it looks. Even though there's also air even in a pita, but it's negligible. Right, you should really eat the maror all together and not little by little. So here again, we see this idea that's mitzaref b'chtei achilat pras, also about eating on Leil HaSeder. Leil b'siman taf ayin hey, sif daled be'ernu, so he says, I explained earlier that Rishonim don't talk about this idea that you have to eat it all at once. Like, you don't have to stick in your mouth and gulp down a kazayit all at once. But rather, the idea is you have to eat without interruption. Ayen sham. If your maror is horseradish, yafigu hamarirut ma'at avalo harbe. So then you're allowed to, like, take off some of the bitterness, but not a lot. You can't take off so much that it's not bitter at all. You can remove a little bit of it. I think what he means is it would be like if you soak it for a little while, something like that. But otherwise, this is altogether a different discussion. But there's a very strong argument to say that you're not yotze with chrein. There's several strong arguments to say you're not yotze with chrein. And it became a minhag. I'm not sure if I still have it. Somebody wrote a very good academic paper on it. But some of it is obvious, and one of them is that, and it's interesting that the Aruch HaShulchan doesn't comment on it, because technically, even from a halachic point of view, chrein is charif. It's not mar. And it has, right, charif has that has halachic ramifications, right? If you cut it with a knife, then the knife is going to get whatever that you cut, like same as cutting onions or something like that. And there are other reasons. We'll go into them, God willing, someday when we learn Hilchot Pesach. Anyway, this is one halacha l'maaseh aspect of this discussion. So maybe
the problem is that the quantities are defined by volume, and if you don't want to have that problem with the air amidst the matter, then you should define it by weight, so you wouldn't have that problem.
Right. But that's why I can tell you, I think this might be in a tshuva of Rav Moshe's, or maybe it is on in the same, but when he talks about matzah on the Seder, I think he says he took a matzah and he ground it up so that it wouldn't have any air in between. So then he would be able to measure how much of the matzah you would need to take. Anyway, we didn't answer all of our questions about shiurim, but I just thought this would be at least a little bit of an introduction. And what we do see is that first of all, we still didn't answer Paul's question about what's the basis for the shiurim. And there it depends, and it depends on the shiur and what you're talking about. Some are considered to be deraita and some are derabanan. So maybe we'll look at a little bit at that next time. And also, maybe next time I'll talk to you a little bit more about this machloket, about whether shiurim are much larger than they used to be or not. So just to mention one more thing about that, which maybe you know, or maybe we've spoken about, that the Chazon Ish was machmir, like a number of the achronim who preceded him, that shiurim are larger. But in his generation, there was another Rav, another Gadol, Rav Chaim Naeh, who essentially held to the idea that the shiurim were as they always were. So his shiurim are much smaller. And if you look at it, there are standard charts. I've shown you some from the Bar Ilan project, and I also have some printed in a Sidur here as a nice chart, where it'll show you the shiur of Rav Chaim Naeh next to the shiur of the Chazon Ish. It depends on your minhag and who you go after. So all I can say is we do the best we can. Next time maybe we'll do a little bit more of this, but then we'll go back to the Gemaras. And the reason we looked at this is because the Gemara had brought up this question about shiurim and about the grogret is the kotevet hagasa, is the kotevet with its garin or without its garin, and is the etzim kesora, is the sora with its klipa or without its klipa. So we brought it up because of this, and we'll go back to the Gemara next week as well, Bezrat Hashem. But I think that's it for today. So that's it, unless we have any more comments or questions. So Bezrat Hashem, see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
And
Okay,
also,
bye-bye. Thank you.
in the last moment, I started to say this before, and I wanted to say it out loud, that this shiur is dedicated to the release of the hostages, protecting the soldiers, protecting Am Yisrael and all of the innocents.
Amen.
And we will not discuss it now because it's too sensitive.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.